The place card was still in my hand when my little brother stood up so fast his chair crashed backward into the marble floor. Every conversation inside that ballroom died at once. Forks stopped moving, glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the violinists near the stage seemed to lose the courage to breathe. And in the middle of all that expensive silence, my brother looked at the bride's father and said in a calm voice that somehow sounded more dangerous than screaming, "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life." I remember the exact feeling that moved through my body in that moment. Not relief, not pride, fear, pure fear. Because I knew men like Richard Ashford, men who smiled while humiliating people, men who used wealth the way other people used fists, men who believed kindness was something they rented out only to people willing to kneel for it. And standing in front of him like that was dangerous. But before I tell you what happened after that night exploded into chaos, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from today? And honestly, does the weather outside match the mood of this story already? Because where I was, standing that night, everything looked beautiful, but the air felt like a storm seconds away from destroying lives. Now, if you've ever been underestimated, disrespected, or made to feel small by people who thought money gave them the right to decide your worth, then hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me because this story is one of the most satisfying emotional revenge stories you'll hear today. And trust me, the ending? Nobody in that ballroom saw it coming. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, survival came before dignity. I learned that lesson young. My parents died when I was barely old, enough to understand what paperwork even meant. One accident, one phone call, one night that split my life into before and after. My little brother Ethan was only 9 at the time, skinny, quiet, always pretending he wasn't scared because he thought being brave would help me somehow. People love talking about strength when they hear stories like ours. They imagine heroic music and inspiring speeches. Real survival is uglier than that. Real survival looks like unpaid bills spread across a kitchen table at 2 a.m. while you calculate which utility company sounds least angry over the phone. It looks like eating crackers for dinner because your little brother already said he was still hungry. It looks like lying constantly. I already ate. I'm not tired. Everything's going to be okay. Those lies become habits after enough years. I worked everywhere. Grocery stores, diners, cleaning offices at night. I spent one winter stocking shelves in a freezing warehouse where my fingers cracked open from cold cardboard and bleach water. Some nights I came home so exhausted I fell asleep still wearing my shoes. But every single morning I got Ethan ready for school. I checked homework. I packed lunches. I signed permission slips pretending I understood what I was doing. There's something lonely about raising someone while still growing up yourself. Nobody congratulates you for it. Nobody claps when you choose responsibility over dreams. They just slowly start expecting you to survive quietly. And Ethan, God, he was smart. The kind of smart that frightened teachers because kids from neighborhoods like ours were not supposed to sound like him. He loved computers before we could even afford one. He used to sit in public libraries reading coding books he barely understood yet. Sometimes I'd watch him through the shelves while pretending to read magazines myself. He'd be so focused, the world disappeared around him. And every time I saw that look on his face, I promised myself something. He would not stay trapped where we came from just because life had trapped me there first. So I sacrificed things quietly. That's the part people never see. Sacrifice is rarely dramatic while it's happening. It's small decisions repeated until they become your whole life. I gave up college after getting accepted because Ethan needed stability more than I needed lectures. I sold jewelry my mother left me to pay for his summer programs. I worked double shifts to buy him a refurbished laptop that sounded like it might explode every time it turned on. When he cried one night because he knew we couldn't afford a school trip, I spent 3 weeks secretly cleaning extra hotel rooms just so I could hand him the money and pretend it worked itself out. And you know what hurts the most? He remembered all of it. Every single thing I tried to hide. By the time Ethan turned 30, he had become everything I hoped he'd be. Intelligent, kind, successful. Not rich yet, but successful in the way that actually matters. He had talent people respected. Companies wanted him. Friends trusted him. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had suffered enough to stop needing approval from strangers. I used to watch him speak during tech presentations and feel something almost impossible to describe. It felt like seeing proof that all those terrible years had meant something. Then he met Clara Ashford. At first, I worried because rich families make me nervous. Not because of jealousy, because of experience. Wealth changes the way some people look at struggle. They stop seeing hardship as circumstance and start seeing it as evidence of inferiority. Clara herself was lovely from the beginning. Warm, educated, thoughtful. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Ethan loved her completely. I could tell by the way his voice softened when he said her name. But her father, Richard Ashford, was the kind of man who made entire rooms tense when he walked into them. Tall, immaculate gray suits. Calm voice. Every word measured like he billed people by the syllable. He owned luxury hotels across the East Coast, sat on nonprofit boards, donated to universities, appeared in magazines beside words like visionary and philanthropist. But the first time he shook my hand, I felt it immediately. That coldness, that subtle evaluation in his eyes. Like he had already calculated my income, education level, and social usefulness before dessert arrived. He never openly insulted me at first. Men like him are too polished for that. Instead, he used smaller cuts. During dinners, he'd ask where I went to school, then nod slowly when I explained I never finished college. He'd compliment Ethan's intelligence while sounding vaguely surprised it existed in our family at all. Once he asked if I still worked, hourly positions, and I remember the way Clara immediately changed the subject because even she heard the contempt hidden inside the question. But Ethan always defended me. Always. If Richard made a comment about ambition, Ethan mentioned my sacrifices. If someone praised his career, he redirected credit toward me. And every single time, Richard's expression tightened just slightly. Like my existence offended his understanding of how success stories were supposed to work. Then came the wedding. It was held at a private country club so expensive I felt underdressed breathing near it. Everything gleamed, crystal chandeliers, white roses taller than children, servers carrying champagne like they were transporting holy water. The room smelled like perfume, polished wood, and money. The kind of money designed to make ordinary people feel temporary. I remember standing outside the ballroom before entering and smoothing down my dress 3 separate times. Not because the dress was bad, because insecurity becomes muscle memory around wealthy people. You start checking yourself constantly. Your posture, your accent, your shoes, whether you belong. But Ethan had personally called me the night before and said something I'll never forget. Tomorrow isn't happening because of them, Maya. It's happening because you kept me alive long enough to reach it. I cried after we hung up, just quietly, into my pillow like a child. So when I entered that ballroom, I was nervous, but proud too. For once, I thought maybe I could just exist peacefully beside the life we fought so hard to build. I should have known men like Richard Ashford never let people like me feel comfortable for long. I found my table near the back, corner of the reception hall. Soft candlelight flickered against polished silverware. The orchestra played low enough that conversations melted together like background static. I smiled politely at a few strangers seated nearby and reached for the little folded name card beside my plate. Then my stomach dropped so violently I thought I might faint. Poor, uneducated sister living off her brother. The words blurred at first because my brain refused to process them. I actually checked the card twice thinking maybe it belonged to someone else. But no. My seat number matched. My name sat underneath the sentence in elegant gold calligraphy. And then came the laughter. Not loud. Worse. Controlled laughter. Covered mouths. Side glances. Rich people laughing carefully enough to preserve appearances while still making sure you hear it. I felt heat crawl up my neck instantly. My fingers went numb around the card. It wasn't only humiliation. It was the realization that this had been planned. Someone typed those words. Someone approved them. Someone placed the card carefully beside my plate, knowing exactly what would happen when I saw it. Across the ballroom, I saw Richard Ashford watching me, smiling, not broadly, just enough. And suddenly, I understood something horrifying. This wasn't about humor. It was a test, a warning, a demonstration of power. He wanted me embarrassed, small, reminded of my place before his daughter officially married into our family. My first instinct was to leave immediately, just disappear quietly before Ethan noticed, because that's what people like me learn to do. We absorb humiliation privately to avoid becoming difficult. I even placed the card back down carefully, because my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. But before I could move, Ethan looked toward my table, and everything changed. Ethan crossed the ballroom before I could stop him. I could see it in the way he moved. Not rushed, not emotional, focused. That scared me more than anger would have. His eyes locked onto the place card still sitting beside my untouched plate, and the second he read it, the entire atmosphere around him changed. Clara followed close behind, confused at first, until she saw my face. Then she looked down at the card and physically recoiled like someone had slapped her. "What the hell is this?" Ethan asked quietly. Nobody answered. That silence told him everything. The bride's family suddenly became very interested in their wine glasses. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked away completely. Cowardice spreads fast in expensive rooms because people with reputations to protect rarely risk standing on the wrong side of power. Then Richard Ashford stood up. Even from across the room, his presence controlled attention. Conversations died, instantly. The orchestra stopped playing mid-song. He adjusted his cufflinks calmly and walked toward us like none of this mattered. Like humiliating someone publicly was just another inconvenience interrupting his evening. "It was a joke," he said smoothly after glancing at the card. "Surely nobody here is fragile enough to create drama over a little humor." The words hit harder than the insult itself because of how casually he delivered them. Like cruelty was sophistication, like humiliation became acceptable if spoken politely enough. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "You printed this. At my wedding." Richard sighed lightly. "Honestly, Ethan, if this is the kind of emotional instability your family brings into situations, perhaps marriage is happening too soon." That sentence changed something inside my brother. I saw it happen in real time. The disappointment, the hurt, the realization that every kindness Richard had ever shown came attached to invisible conditions. Clara stepped forward immediately. "Dad, apologize." Richard looked genuinely annoyed by her tone. "For what? Your future sister-in-law should learn how to survive harmless teasing. The world is not a charity designed around wounded feelings." My chest tightened. I wanted to disappear. Every eye in the ballroom felt glued to me now. Some people pitied me. Others looked entertained. A few looked relieved it wasn't happening to them. But Ethan never looked away from Richard. "You don't get to speak to her like that," he said. Richard gave a small smile. "Interesting. After everything my connections have done for your career, I expected a little more perspective." There it was. Not kindness, ownership. Suddenly, every expensive dinner invitation made sense. Every networking opportunity. Every compliment. Richard never saw Ethan as family. He saw him as an investment he expected loyalty from. Ethan's jaw tightened hard enough I thought his teeth might crack. Everything I earned myself. Richard laughed softly. Of course you believe that. Ambitious young men usually do. Clara looked horrified now. Dad, stop talking. But he ignored her completely. Men like Richard only hear themselves once they feel challenged. Then he looked directly at me. You should have stayed grateful, Maya. People are usually more welcoming when you understand your social position. I cannot fully describe what those words felt like. Not because they were shocking, because part of me had feared them for years. Feared that wealthy people secretly viewed me exactly this way. Like sacrifice without status meant nothing. Like surviving hardship made you useful but never respectable. For a second, I almost broke. My throat burned. My hands trembled. I could actually feel old insecurities crawling back to life inside me. Every shift I worked, every opportunity I buried, every room where I felt less educated, less polished, less worthy. Then Ethan reached for my hand, and suddenly I remembered something important. I had not ruined my life raising him. I had built one. She belongs anywhere I stand, Ethan said. The room went completely silent again. Richard's expression hardened for the first time that night. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal the anger beneath his polished image. He looked at Ethan the way wealthy men look at employees becoming inconvenient. You're making a very expensive mistake, Richard said quietly. Ethan didn't even blink. No, you already made it. Clara grabbed Ethan's arm gently, almost pleading. Please, not like this. But the damage was already done. You could feel it spreading through the ballroom. Guests whispering. Phones quietly appearing beneath tables. People sensing scandal and adjusting their loyalties in real time. Then Richard pulled out his phone. And that's when things became truly dangerous. I think, he said calmly while scrolling through contacts, certain business arrangements may need reconsideration after tonight. Ethan went still. I knew immediately what Richard was doing, and judging by the panic on Clara's face, so did she. Dad, she whispered, don't. But he already had the phone to his ear. Harrington and Vale, he said once someone answered. Yes, regarding the Bennett hire, I believe there are concerns requiring immediate review. My stomach dropped. That company had just offered Ethan his dream position 2 weeks earlier. A job he'd worked years for, a job that would completely change his future. And Richard was threatening it publicly. Not because Ethan failed, because he defended me. You can't do that, Clara said. Richard looked almost amused. Sweetheart, powerful partnerships rely on professionalism. Tonight has demonstrated certain liabilities. Ethan's face lost all color, but his voice stayed calm somehow. You're trying to punish me for protecting my sister. Richard lowered the phone slowly. No, I'm teaching you how the real world works. That sentence poisoned the entire room, because everyone understood now. This was no misunderstanding, no bad joke. Richard Ashford was openly using wealth and influence like weapons against his future son-in-law in front of hundreds of witnesses. And the terrifying part? He genuinely believed he was justified. The ballroom no longer felt like a wedding reception. It felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, and the only thing left was watching the punishment unfold. In real time, Ethan stood still, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had shifted, controlled but unstable, like a man holding back something explosive. Clara had gone pale beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she stared. at her father like she was seeing him for the first time instead of the man who raised her. And Richard Ashford. He looked almost satisfied, like he believed he had regained control of the room simply by picking up his phone. "I warned you," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the silence. "Opportunities are not guaranteed when people choose. Emotional reactions over reason." That was when something inside me shifted. Not anger, not fear, something colder, clarity. Because I realized this wasn't just about humiliation anymore. It was about control. Everything he did, every word he spoke, every threat he made was designed to remind everyone in that room that their stability existed only as long as he allowed it. And in that moment, I understood why Ethan had always been so careful around him without even realizing it. Because men like Richard don't argue, they assign consequences. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice low but steady. "You think I need your approval to survive?" Richard didn't even look at him while typing on his phone. "No. I think you already understand you needed it more than you're willing to admit." That line landed differently. Not loud, not dramatic, but calculated, the kind of sentence designed to sit inside someone's mind long after the room is empty. I felt Ethan's grip tighten slightly around my hand again, not out of fear this time, but restraint. He was trying not to give Richard exactly what he wanted, a reaction he could label as instability. Clara suddenly stepped forward. "Dad, stop it. You're ruining everything." For the first time that night, Richard actually looked at her properly. Not as an observer, not as an audience member, as a daughter. But there was no softness in his expression. Only disappointment, sharp and immediate. "I am protecting you," he said quietly, "from making irreversible mistakes because of misplaced emotions." Clara shook her head, tears building in her eyes. "You don't get to decide what my life costs." Something flickered in his expression then. Not guilt. Not remorse. Something closer to disbelief that she was resisting him at all. "You always had everything you needed," he said, voice tightening slightly. "Don't confuse privilege with oppression." The silence that followed was suffocating, because everyone in that room understood what was happening now. This wasn't just a conflict between families. It was a man realizing his control was slipping and reacting in the only way he knew how: financial pressure, professional threats, and emotional intimidation disguised as logic. Ethan finally stepped forward. "If you destroy my career over this, you're not proving strength. You're proving insecurity." Richard gave a small, dismissive laugh without looking up from his phone. "You really think this is about you? This is about standards, about what kind of behavior gets rewarded in professional environments." That was the moment Clara snapped. She walked directly toward him, stopping only when she was close enough that everyone in the room could hear her breathing. "Then cancel it," she said quietly. "Cancel everything. If you think humiliating people at a wedding is professional behavior, then cancel it all." Richard finally froze, not dramatically. Just a pause, a slight stillness that spread through his posture like ice forming under pressure. "You're emotional," he said again, but this time it sounded less confident. Clara didn't move. "No, I'm done being silent so you can feel powerful." And that's when something in the room shifted again. Because for the first time, Richard didn't have full agreement. People weren't laughing anymore. They weren't even whispering. They were watching, carefully, like witnesses realizing they might eventually be called to speak. Ethan looked at me briefly, and I saw it in his eyes. Not anger now. Decision. "End the call," he said. Richard slowly lowered the phone, but didn't put it away. "You're making a mistake you won't recover from." Ethan nodded once. "No, I'm making sure you can't keep doing this to people." For a split second, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Even the air felt held in place. And then Richard's expression changed again, but this time it wasn't anger. It was calculation. The kind that comes when a man realizes he can no longer win by intimidation alone. "Fine," he said softly. "Let's see how far principle gets you when reality responds." He turned slightly toward the guests, his voice shifting into something smoother, more controlled, more public-facing. "I hope everyone here understands that emotional decisions often have consequences beyond a single evening. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was preparation. A man laying groundwork for retaliation that would look justified on paper. And I remember thinking, very clearly in that moment, this isn't over. This is just the beginning of what he's willing to destroy. Because powerful men don't lose control quietly. They reorganize it." The shift in Richard Ashford's tone changed everything in the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried a different weight now, like the calm before something deliberately planned. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was repositioning, and I could feel it in my chest like a slow tightening wire. The guests had sensed it too. The nervous laughter was gone. The whispering had stopped. Even people who had been watching with curiosity now looked uneasy because they understood something important without anyone saying it out loud. This man wasn't finished. He was just choosing his next move carefully. Ethan stood beside me, still holding my hand, but his grip had changed. Not weaker, not stronger, just focused, like he was anchoring himself to something real in a room that suddenly felt unstable. Clara stood a few steps away from her father now, her posture rigid, her face pale but no longer passive. Something in her had shifted completely. The illusion of him as untouchable authority had cracked, and what remained was something far more dangerous to him than anger: clarity. Richard adjusted his cufflinks again, a habit I realized he used whenever he wanted to regain psychological control. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice smooth again, almost conversational. "I have no personal issue with anyone here, but I do have professional standards, and those standards extend to who I choose to support." It sounded reasonable if you didn't understand the context. That was the trick. Men like him never sounded like villains. They sounded like managers, like decision-makers, like people simply describing how the world works. Ethan finally let go of my hand. I felt it instantly. Not abandonment, preparation. "I want you to say it directly," Ethan said quietly. "Say what you just did on the phone." A few guests shifted again. The tension tightened. Richard exhaled slowly. "I made a call to reassess a pending offer based on new information about conduct at a public event." "New information?" Ethan repeated. "Yes," Richard replied calmly. "Behavior has consequences." Clara stepped forward again, her voice shaking but steady. "You're calling humiliation a behavior issue?" Richard didn't even look at her this time. "I'm calling emotional volatility a risk factor." That sentence landed like a slap. But worse than that, it exposed everything. Because now it wasn't just about Ethan or me. It was about how he viewed all of us, not as people, as risks, variables, assets to manage. I felt something inside me go very still. Not fear, understanding. I looked at him properly for the first time that night, not as Ethan's future father-in-law, not as a wealthy man, but as what he actually was. A man who had never been challenged without consequence. A man who had never had to face the reality of losing control without being able to buy it back. And I realized something else. He didn't actually understand us. He understood leverage, but not endurance, not sacrifice. Not the kind of love that survives poverty, exhaustion, and years of quiet suffering without ever becoming something he could threaten into submission. Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter now. You keep saying standards, but all I see is punishment for defending my family. Richard finally turned to him fully. Then you are confusing emotion with professionalism. Ethan nodded slowly, like he was absorbing something, not agreeing with it. No, he said. I think you're confusing control with leadership. That was the first time Richard's expression tightened for more than a second. Not anger. Recognition of resistance. Clara stepped between them slightly, her voice breaking now. Dad, please, just stop. This is our wedding day. For a second, something almost human flickered across Richard's face. Almost. But then, it hardened again, like he physically pushed it down. Then act like it, he said. Stop turning it into a spectacle. The word spectacle made my stomach turn, because that was how he saw it. Not humiliation, not cruelty, a disruption. To order. Ethan took a slow breath, then spoke in a way I had never heard from him before. Not emotional, not reactive, controlled. If you move forward with canceling that offer, he said, then you're not just punishing me. You're publicly admitting that your business decisions depend on personal retaliation. The room changed again. People were listening differently now. Not as guests at a wedding, as witnesses to something that could spill beyond this room. Richard tilted his head slightly. Careful, he said softly. That sounds like a threat. Ethan didn't blink. No, that sounds like accountability. And for the first time, I saw something subtle happen in Richard's posture. Not retreat, not fear, assessment. He was recalculating Ethan now. Not as a son-in-law, as a problem that wasn't responding the way it should. Clara suddenly reached for Ethan's arm again, her voice breaking. Don't let him pull you into this, please. But Ethan didn't move away from her this time. He looked at her father instead. You wanted loyalty, he said. But what you actually wanted was obedience. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Because that sentence couldn't be ignored. It couldn't be reframed as emotional. It was precise, and everyone understood it. Richard slowly straightened, his expression flattening again. You've made your position clear, he said quietly. So I will make mine equally clear. He looked around the room briefly, then back at Ethan. This engagement, this opportunity, and any associated professional arrangements are now under review. There it was again. Control disguised as process. But this time, something different happened. Clara stepped fully in front of Ethan, and she said something that no one in that room expected. Then I'm done. Her voice didn't shake this time. It cut through the air cleanly. Richard blinked once. Excuse me? I said I'm done, she repeated. If you can destroy someone's career over protecting his sister, then I don't trust anything you've built around me either. The room went completely silent again. Not because it was dramatic, because it was irreversible. And I watched Richard Ashford realize, for the first time that night, that he wasn't just losing control of the situation. He was losing his daughter's belief in him. And men like him don't recover from that easily. For a few seconds after Clara spoke, nobody in the ballroom moved. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows shock. It was the kind that follows realization. The kind where people understand, without anyone explaining it, that something permanent has just broken. Richard Ashford stood completely still, staring at his daughter like her words had not fully reached him yet. Not because he hadn't heard them, but because his mind was refusing to accept them as final. You don't mean that, he said quietly. Clara didn't flinch. I do. The word landed with more weight than anything said all night. No anger. No hesitation. Just certainty. Ethan looked at her like he didn't know whether to step closer or give her space, like he was witnessing someone choose a version of themselves he had never seen before. I could feel my chest tighten because I knew what that moment cost her. Not just a relationship, a lifetime of conditioning, approval, identity, everything she had been taught to protect. Richard exhaled sharply, the first crack in his composure, all evening. You are making an emotional decision in a highly inappropriate setting. Clara shook her head slowly. No. I'm making the first clear decision I've ever made in this room. That was when I saw it. Not rage yet, disbelief, turning into something sharper. Richard looked around the room as if expecting someone to intervene, to correct this, to restore order. But nobody did. Guests sat frozen, aware they were witnessing something that had moved beyond a private family issue and into something socially irreversible. Ethan finally spoke again, quieter now, but steady. You keep trying to call this emotional instability. But what you're doing is punishment. Richard's eyes snapped back to him. I am protecting my daughter's future. Clara laughed once, but there was no humor in it. From what? From people who love her without conditions? That question hit harder than any accusation. For the first time, Richard didn't respond immediately, and that silence told us more than any answer could have. I stepped slightly forward, not because I wanted attention, but because I realized something important in that moment. This wasn't just about Ethan's career anymore. It was about something deeper that Richard had been avoiding his entire life. Accountability. You called it a joke, I said quietly, my voice steady even though my heart wasn't. You printed humiliation and placed it at my seat so I would find it in front of your guests. You watched them laugh, and you called it humor. Richard turned his attention to me slowly, like I was an inconvenience he had temporarily forgotten about. You're still clinging to that? Something inside me almost snapped, but instead, I felt clarity again. The same calm I always felt when I stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. Yes, I said. Because it wasn't a joke. It was a message. You just didn't expect it to have consequences. A few guests shifted uncomfortably again. Someone near the back stood up slightly, then sat back down. Nobody wanted to be seen choosing a side too early. Richard's voice dropped. You are not important enough for consequences to matter. And there it was. The truth, finally unfiltered. Clara's face changed instantly. Dad! But she didn't finish. Because Ethan let go of my hand and took one step forward. Not aggressive, not emotional. Final. Then you won't mind if people see exactly how you operate, Ethan said. Richard narrowed his eyes slightly. Careful. Ethan nodded once. I am careful. That's why I documented everything. That sentence changed the air in the room instantly. For the first time, Richard looked uncertain, not afraid, but recalculating risk. Clara slowly turned toward Ethan. What do you mean documented? Ethan didn't look away from Richard when he answered. The place card, the emails from the wedding planner, the phone call you made in front of everyone, the threats, all of it. A low murmur spread through the guests now. Phones that had been discreet before were no longer hidden. Richard's expression tightened. You recorded private conversations? In my home. Ethan finally smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was controlled. No. I recorded public behavior in a public setting where you chose to make it everyone's business. Silence again. Different this time. Heavier. Because Richard now understood something he hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just emotional conflict anymore. This was exposure. Clara stepped fully beside Ethan, her voice shaking again but firm. Dad, stop. Just apologize. Please. before this becomes something you can't undo. And for a second, I thought he might. Just a second. There was a flicker in his expression. A moment where the entire room could have been saved by a single sentence. But Richard Ashford did not apologize. Instead, he straightened his jacket again and said quietly, "I will not be coerced into performing guilt for an audience." That was his final mistake, because that sentence confirmed everything. Ethan nodded slowly. "Then don't." He pulled his phone out and pressed send. The reaction was immediate, not from Richard, from the room, from the guests, from the shift in energy that happens when people realize something irreversible has just been released into the world beyond these walls. Richard's eyes sharpened. "What did you just do?" Ethan looked up calmly. "I let the truth leave the room." Clara turned pale again. "Ethan..." But he didn't stop. "I didn't want revenge," he said. "I wanted accountability, and you made it very clear tonight that you don't understand the difference." Richard took a step forward for the first time all night that wasn't controlled. "You will regret this." Ethan met his eyes. "No, I'll remember it." And for the first time, Richard had nothing immediate to say, because in that moment, the balance of power didn't just shift, it left the room. What happened next didn't feel like a fight anymore. It felt like consequences finally arriving.